altitude of 11,000 meters, a passenger aircraft accelerates to 950 kilometers per hour and seems to hit an invisible wall. It seems to us that aircraft could fly much faster, but that's not the case. A speed of around 950 kilometers per hour isn't a technological limit. It's the limit beyond which air turns into a threat. Already when approaching 1,000 kilometers per hour, the wing collides with shock waves, causing severe turbulence. Drag increases many times over, and the load on the structure reaches tens of tons. Even a small excess of speed can lead to loss of control. Today we'll figure out why humanity, having conquered space, can't accelerate an ordinary aircraft even twofold, and what exactly happens at the moment when speed becomes too high. Let's begin. The history of modern aviation restrictions began with an incident in the skies over the Mediterranean Sea. On January 10, 1954, the British airliner Comet took off from Rome. It was the world's first jet passenger aircraft, which flew twice as fast and high as its predecessors. On board were 35 people who enjoyed the quiet unavailable in old propeller machines. 20 minutes after takeoff, communication was lost. Eyewitnesses saw a fiery flash in the sky, after which the aircraft's debris rained down into the water. To find the answer, they built a huge pool in which they placed the aircraft's fuselage. Pumps alternately forced pressure inside the hull and released it, imitating each takeoff and landing. After 3,000 cycles, the metal burst. A tiny crack appeared in the skin near the corner of a rectangular window. It turned out that at a speed of 900 kilometers per hour and enormous altitude, the aircraft's hull works like a balloon. At an altitude of 11,000 meters, the air outside is rarefied, while inside pressure is maintained for breathing. The fuselage constantly inflates and compresses. Stress accumulated in the corners of the square windows until the metal burst like an overstretched string. Since then, windows in all aircraft have become only round. This event determined the ideal flight level for aviation, 11,000 meters. It's the place where the air is rarefied enough not to hinder movement, but dense enough to hold the machine. It was precisely this balance between atmospheric density and metal strength that locked in the limit of 950 kilometers per hour. It's the point where the airliner flies most efficiently, without risking falling apart from metal fatigue. But what happens if a pilot decides to break this fragile equilibrium and accelerate a little harder? It turns out that even if the hull withstands the pressure, the aircraft may suddenly stop obeying the yoke, turning into an uncontrollable heap of metal. Pilots call this state the coffin corner, and it was precisely into this invisible trap that one of the most modern airliners of our time fell over the nighttime Atlantic. The night of June 1, 2009, became one of the darkest pages in the history of aviation. The modern airliner of flight, Air France 447, flew over the nighttime Atlantic at an altitude of 11,000 meters. On board were 228 people, most of whom were sleeping. Suddenly, due to icing of the sensors, the computer lost data about the speed. Chaos began in the cockpit. The instruments displayed insane figures, and audio signals reported imminent danger. The airliner began to fall, and 3.5 minutes later crashed into the ocean. This tragedy made the world start talking about a frightening phenomenon that pilots call the coffin corner. Imagine you're walking along a narrow rope over an abyss. On one side, the abyss of stalling. At such an altitude, the air is so rarefied that the wings need to fly very fast just to stay in the sky. As soon as you slow down, the aircraft will drop like a stone. On the other side, destruction in the air. If you accelerate a little harder, you'll reach the sound barrier. The air will turn into a concrete wall. A terrible shaking will begin, and the control surfaces will simply fail. The higher the aircraft flies, the narrower this rope becomes. At some point, the safe corridor of speeds narrows to a tiny gap. There's no right to error here. A step left, a step right, and the machine becomes uncontrollable. On that fateful night, the pilots in the darkness couldn't hold the airliner in this narrow gap. So that such mistakes wouldn't repeat, engineers created digital locks. Even if a pilot decides to wring everything out of the aircraft, the smart electronics will simply ignore the command. The computer is an invisible guardian that knows. Speed above 950 kilometers per hour turns air into a trap, but why did precisely this figure become the limit? It turns out that even when an aircraft flies slower than sound, supersonic storms can rage on its wings. In the 40s, test pilots faced this head-on, not understanding why their machines suddenly began to live their own lives and throw themselves into the ground. The solution to this secret lies in the invisible waves that arise right above the passengers' heads. In the 40s of the last century, aviation encountered a mystery that seemed inexplicable to contemporaries. Test pilots, when trying to wring the maximum out of new jet engines, discovered that the machine suddenly changed its behavior. One of the pilots recorded a dangerous case. When the aircraft accelerated to a speed of around 900 kilometers per hour, it stopped obeying the yoke. The tester pulled the handle toward himself to raise the nose, but the apparatus instead rushed toward the ground even harder. This phenomenon was called control reversal. The technology behaved unpredictably, and many pilots didn't survive, failing to cope with a force that literally changed the logic of flight. The reason for this behavior lay in how air flows around the hull at enormous speeds. To understand this, imagine the movement of air as a flow of water. The air that passes over the wing is forced to run along its curved upper part faster than along the flat bottom. When the aircraft itself flies at a speed of 950 kilometers per hour, the airflow at the wing's curve accelerates to a critical limit. At this point, the air stops gliding smoothly along the metal and begins to behave like a solid obstacle. Invisible air shocks arise, which create colossal vibration and hinder normal movement. These sharp pressure jumps completely change the load on the parts. They knock the smooth airflow off the movable parts of the wing that are responsible for turns and lift, making them useless.
It was precisely at this moment that the reverse effect arose. The air pressed on the structure so strongly that any attempts by the pilot to correct the situation led to the opposite result. Engineers realized that the usual wing shape, which works excellently at ordinary speeds, becomes the main obstacle when trying to accelerate faster than 1,000 kilometers per hour. The swept wings of modern aircraft, directed back at an angle, help push back this moment. But even such a shape doesn't give full freedom. To fly faster and more stably, one would have to make the wings thin and sharp, like a knife blade. However, such wings won't be able to hold heavy weight during takeoff and landing at low speeds. 950 kilometers per hour became that limit beyond which a reliable structure turns into a dangerous and uncontrollable object. But physics is only part of the problem. It turns out that a thirst for speed is capable of ruining an airline in a matter of months. When the instrument needle passes the mark of 1,000 kilometers, each extra kilometer costs so much that the price of a ticket becomes unaffordable. It was precisely this money question that forced Boeing's designers to halt work on their most ambitious and fast project in a single day. The answer lies in the ruthless mathematics of fuel expenses. In the early 2000s, Boeing presented the Sonic Cruiser project, which was supposed to bring about a revolution. This aircraft of the future promised a speed of more than 1,100 kilometers per hour, which allowed saving several hours on long-haul flights. Airlines were delighted. But in December 2002, the project was suddenly closed. Huge investments were written off, and instead of a speed breakthrough, the world received the ordinary speed Boeing 787. The reason lay in the figures that made the project pointless. The main problem was air resistance. At a speed of 950 kilometers per hour, the aircraft already spends a mass of energy breaking through the atmosphere. But as soon as the engineers tried to add another 100 kilometers per hour, resistance grew many times over. The mathematics was merciless. To save 1 hour of time, it was necessary to burn almost twice as much fuel. This turned an airplane ticket into an item of luxury that no one wanted to buy. The aircraft became too heavy because of the enormous engines and fuel reserves, leaving almost no room for passengers. Airports also turned out not to be ready for such speeds. It emerged that the time gain in the sky was completely lost in queues for landing and baggage claim. Airlines realized that it's more profitable to carry many people slowly than a few quickly. In the end, the industry chose the path of economy, forever abandoning the race for speed. But even if you forget about money, there exists a limit that's impossible to bypass. When metal begins to literally melt and stretch from air friction, processes dangerous to life begin. Have you ever heard of an aircraft that became 30 centimeters longer during a flight? This isn't fiction, but the reality of the legendary Concorde. Friction against the air at enormous speed heated its hull to such temperatures that the metal began to behave unpredictably, creating a threat that not even the world's wealthiest corporations are able to solve. In the history of aviation, there was a period when it seemed that physics had surrendered under the onslaught of engineering genius. The legendary Concorde carried passengers across the ocean faster than a bullet, but each such flight was accompanied by an incredible phenomenon. When the aircraft accelerated to 2,000 kilometers per hour, friction against the air particles heated its nose part to 127 degrees Celsius. The metal of the hull, under the influence of such heat, began to expand so strongly that between the control panels in the pilot's cockpit and the rear wall, a huge gap appeared. You could freely stick a palm into it. During the flight, the aircraft became 30 centimeters longer, and after cooling on the ground, it compressed again to ordinary dimensions. This frightening feature of the Concorde clearly showed scientists what's called the thermal barrier. At speeds above 1,000 kilometers per hour, air stops being simply a transparent gas and turns into something like sandpaper. It rubs against the skin with enormous force, turning movement into pure thermal energy. Ordinary aviation aluminum, from which almost all modern airliners are built, begins to lose its strength already at slight heating. If you accelerate an ordinary Boeing to such speeds, its hull will become soft like a plastic bottle in boiling water. So that the Concorde wouldn't fall apart in the sky, engineers had to invent special alloys that cost fabulous money and required jeweler's care. It was precisely this temperature limit that became an insurmountable obstacle for mass transportation. To build an aircraft that isn't afraid of heat, you need titanium or super strong steel, as well as the most complex cooling systems that permeate the entire fuselage. This makes the structure incredibly heavy and complex to produce. Ordinary cheap materials simply don't survive in such conditions. Even if we solve the fuel problem, we'll still run into the fact that metal has its limits of endurance. Creating a fast and at the same time inexpensive aircraft from standard materials is physically impossible. But even if you build a perfectly strong and heat-resistant hull, another problem arises that's impossible to hide. Speed generates a sound phenomenon capable of causing panic on Earth. At some point, the heavenly roar became so unbearable that people had to choose between fast flight and a peaceful life in their homes. In the early 70s, residents of the United States of America encountered a phenomenon that frightened entire cities. Imagine an aircraft flies over your house, and in the same second a sound resembling a powerful explosion rings out. In the rooms, glass shattered, things fell off shelves, and car alarms went off en masse in parked cars. People ran out into the streets in panic, not understanding what had happened. These weren't military exercises or a series of terrorist attacks. This was how a supersonic passenger airliner, which was trying to deliver people from one point to another a little faster than usual, announced itself. The citizens' anger was so great that the government had to choose between technical progress and the peace of millions of people. The reason for this frightening roar is hidden in how air reacts to very fast movement. When an aircraft flies at its ordinary speed, the sound of its engines goes forward and to the sides. The air manages to smoothly flow around the wings, but as soon as the aircraft accelerates faster than 1,000 kilometers per hour, it begins to overtake its own sound. The air in front of the machine's nose doesn't manage to part and gets compressed into an incredibly dense, invisible wall. This shockwave stretches behind the aircraft as a huge invisible tail. When this tail reaches the ground, everything under it receives a sharp air blow. It's precisely this that we hear as a deafening explosion. It became clear that fast flights turn into an ecological problem. An aircraft in the sky became a source of constant destruction on Earth. Because of this, a legal impasse arose. Even if engineers built the most perfect and reliable airliner, it simply would be banned from flying over land. Most countries of the world introduce strict laws that allow exceeding the speed only over uninhabited oceans. International rules effectively put an end to the idea of superfast flights between cities within continents. It became simply unprofitable for airlines to build machines that can show their power only over water, while over land they're obliged to plod along in the general flow. Thus, modern laws finally locked in the limit of 950 kilometers per hour. Engineers realized that fighting physics and the protests of the population is useless. The sky became a space of strict order, where silence is valued higher than a saved hour of time. But does this mean that aviation stopped developing? In reality, what seems to us like a halt in development is a point of ideal balance. We've come to the line where the capabilities of technology, the price of a ticket, and the laws of nature have finally converged at one point. Why has no one in 50 years managed to propose anything better than this speed limit? The answer lies in the final formula of the ideal flight. To many, it seems that modern aviation is frozen in the past,
since we fly at the same speed as our grandfathers half a century ago. But in reality, the mark of 950 kilometers per hour was for decades not a sign of engineers' helplessness, but their greatest victory. It's the point at which physics, economics, and safety finally stopped arguing with each other. We learned to build aircraft that don't get destroyed by vibrations, don't frighten people with a roar, and at the same time allow a ticket to the other end of the world to cost less than a new smartphone. This limit became the invisible foundation on which the entire world order of travel rested. However, history doesn't stand still, and technological barriers that seemed eternal are beginning to crumble under the pressure of new decrees. On June 19, 2025, President Donald Trump signed a historic document that repeals the old 1973 ban on supersonic flights over land. This step opened the way for a new generation of aircraft that engineers call quiet supersonic airliners. Thanks to a special hull shape, they're able to dampen that very deafening explosion, turning it into a barely audible clap. This means that the era of forced slowdown may come to an end, and we again stand on the threshold of great races in the sky. If you look into this new future, then the airliners of tomorrow will fight not only for speed, but for every decibel of silence. The industry realized that progress is possible only when it doesn't disturb people on Earth. The sky still has its immutable laws that can't be bribed. But now engineers have their hands free to try to circumvent them with the help of high technologies and new materials. We're entering an era where the compromise between time and comfort will be reconsidered. If you found it interesting to learn what the familiar hum of an aircraft outside the window conceals, subscribe to the channel. Here we break down how things are arranged that seem ordinary to us, but in reality balance on the edge of the laws of physics. Ahead, there are still many stories about why the world around us looks exactly the way it does. Don't miss the next dive into the details.